Scott, we've talked quite a bit about the running back position. You are kind of our resident fantasy football guy on this program, and there's been a lot of now fantasy football drafts won't be taking place for probably a couple of months, obviously, but mini camps just ended. John Ross, I believe, did not practice in those sessions. He's still kind of recovering from some stuff. Obviously, we talked about Joe Mixon being looking very good in practices. But when you come to fantasy football options, and people that listen to the show might be looking at some options, some Bengals players' options in their fantasy football drafts, is John Ross or is Joe Mixon a better fantasy football option for people out there? Now, I think on paper, running backs tend to bring a bit more value, especially those that can catch the football. You look at both. There's pluses and minuses for both. I think Mixon maybe has, on paper, at least when you first ask the question, has a little bit more of a leg up. But, John Ross has that big playability and should be ready to go at the onset of the season. And, he might be asked to do just a couple of things, but they could be plays that create big touchdowns, that sort of thing. So from a fantasy football perspective, as we sit here in late June, who is the better fantasy football option if a team owner has to come and make the decision between one of those two guys?
Well, part of my answer, I'm actually going to reserve judgment until the end of August, but I'm going to give my reason why. If you look at the Bengals' number 2 receiver, so basically the guy behind A.J. Green, the last 4 years, he's whoever that's been, Sanu, Jones, whoever, has pretty consistently averaged 60 catches, 800 yards, and 6 touchdowns per season. That's pretty decent production. That's a decent number 3 receiver on your fantasy team. So if Ross is going to be the number 2, I would be happy with him because that's a decent receiver who's going to start some weeks. If Ross does not become the number 2, if he's no better than number 3, the production historically for the Bengals drops off dramatically. The number 3 receiver, the last 4 seasons or so, is averaging under 40 catches, 400 yards, and 1 touchdown. So you have to look at Ross, and you see LaFell, who's probably in front of him, Tyler Boyd, who's probably in front of him. So he could be his number 4, and he's got to ask both those guys to become number 2. So I'm going to say right now in June, on June 21st, on the first day of summer, I'm going to say Ross is probably not going to put up the production of the Bengals number 2, but probably closer to number 3, if even that. And if that's the case, 400 yards and 1 touchdown really isn't draftable in most fantasy leagues, unless if you're doing dynasty or but doing like a regular redraft, 12-team league, whether it's PPR or not, that's just not a draftable stat line you want from a guy. Mixon, on the other hand, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of an unknown in the same way because he's probably going to, if all things being equal, if they still give Hill the short yardage and the goal line starting the year, and if Bernard comes back as healthy as they're saying he is, they're probably a 3-headed monster, and as horrible as a 2-headed monster is, a 3-headed is even worse. Although the one thing we have seen from Carolina, who has run with 3 running backs including Newton. So Newton, Williams, and Stewart for a while, and then after Williams, it's been they all seem to be able to get their numbers, so to speak. And with the lack of great running backs, because a lot of teams just aren't using the high volume workhorses anymore. And I'm inclined to go with Mixon right now. And part of the reason too with that is you figure there's a lot of ifs for Mixon to only be in a 3-headed system. You have to assume that they keep feeding the ball to a Hill who may not be effective, and you have to assume Bernard has no setbacks and Bernard is as healthy as they're saying he is. Either of those could change. If they change, that's only better for Mixon. So I'm going to say, all signs as of right now probably point to Mixon getting pretty good volume. And one thing that I think I don't know how many people are kind of considering this, is that he catches the ball very well. Some people consider him the best receiving running back in the draft, even ahead of a guy like Christian McCaffrey, who is known as a good receiver. So that's a lot of extra production there. And especially if Bernard goes down, he kind of gives you what Bernard has in the elusiveness in the receiving, but he can also give you what Hill has because he's 228 pounds. He's the guy that can run between the tackles. That wasn't his specialty in college, but it's something he can do. So, his upside is definitely very up. And I'd say he has a higher floor and a higher ceiling than Ross, at least in this first year. So between the two of them, if all things being equal, if I'm using the same pick, like a mid-late round pick, I would lean towards Mixon as of today. Now, 3 months I may have a different answer, but right now I'm going Mixon.
Yeah, and I think most people would. The one thing, the thing that makes it tricky, though, the Bengals, when he's healthy, the Bengals will use Giovanni Bernard in passing situations, which could cut some of those catches that Mixon could get as a rookie. And as Zachary Stemple pointed out in our YouTube chat, he expects Hill to get an extension because he's a solid red zone scorer. So, if you remember, Scott, back in the late 90s, in the wonderful era of Bengals football that was ensuing at that point, the Bengals had Kajana Carter, who had a plethora of injuries, but they still, they were still sticking with him, but they also added Garrison Hurst. And what they did for a long time, I believe it was a year or 2 years, but what they did in most of the games is they gave the ball to Hurst basically essentially between the 20s, the 20-yard lines. And he would get them very close to the goal line, and Kajana Carter would then punch it in from there. That might be something that happens this year with Mixon and Jeremy Hill. Jeremy Hill has had some issues, had a great rookie season, has had some issues since, but has a nose for the end zone. He has scored a lot of touchdowns, and that also can cut into Mixon's production. Do you still see Jeremy Hill being that goal line guy, especially early on, or do you think Mixon's going to just run away with this competition?
I'd say early in the year they're probably going to give it to Mixon because, as Marvin Lewis mentioned last year at his press conference, he's kind of afraid of rookies. One of his famous lines from late in the year where he doesn't trust rookies, so he won't give them playing time, but he doesn't give them playing time because he doesn't trust them, but he doesn't trust them because it's kind of one of those circles where they can't get on the field because he's scared of they might fail, and he's scared they might fail because they don't have experience, and don't have experience because they don't. Anyway, long story short, I think Hill's going to be the guy to begin the year in that regard. As far as an extension, one interesting thing, if you look at the Bengals historically, they're very good about having two guys for a similar position. They'll extend one, and then the other one they always let go. So, for example, you look at safety. They extended Georgia Loca. They let Reggie Nelson walk. Guard, they signed Clint Bowling. They let Kevin Zeitler walk. And there's several other examples, like defensive end. They tried to sign Michael Johnson, was it 5 years ago? He didn't take it. They franchised him. They gave that contract to Carlos Dunlap. They let Johnson walk. And then, of course, he came back a year later. So that being said, they extended Giovanni Bernard, which seems to imply that, as a result, they would let Hill walk. And then you look at what they did. They just drafted his replacement in Mixon. So it would seem, I think, going forward beyond 2017, it's probably Mixon's job to lose. But I think this year they probably are going to try to find some way to get all three of them in there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, that's one of those position groups. We talked about it in the earlier segments. One of those position groups that's very crowded in. There might not be a surprising cut. There probably won't be a surprising cut in the running back position, but what you might see in terms of roles might be vastly different in amount of touches and all of that sort of thing than what we've seen in the past couple of years. But for now, I think we're in agreement. Mixon is probably a little bit of the safer bet as a higher fantasy pick than John Ross, but don't underestimate John Ross's ability to stretch the field. even take a screen pass a long way. And, if he's a guy that might be, maybe he didn't get drafted, maybe the Bengals aren't using him a bunch earlier in the year, and you need a guy to come in, fill a bye week spot, he might be a very good, very explosive option for you to add as a waiver wire claim. I think that that's going to be, as it is with a lot of rookies, I think he's going to be a guy that gets better as the year goes on, has more big plays as the year goes on. As we saw from Tyler Boyd as well, he made quite a few plays down the stretch and was pretty sure-handed down the stretch as a rookie. So, I think it's okay to expect some big things from both of those guys. It's just a matter of the fact that there are other talented players in their position groups, and some are slated ahead of them on the depth chart.
What
Scott,
I think you mentioned.
Go. Yeah.
You mentioned Boyd as far as a fantasy option. I think the challenge with him is going to be he's probably going to be one of these guys who gets you, 10 yards, 20 yards, 80 yards, and a touchdown next week.
Right.
10. And so you've got to get, those 2 or 3 weeks he has those big games. If you can nail those right, then
exactly.
You have this fantasy thing down.
Yeah, he'll get you two and a half points one week and 17 points the next,
Yeah, he's going to be a very feast or famine guy, and you've got to be able to nail those, 2-3 weeks that he really explodes.
Yeah, absolutely.